When I was 5 years old, I saw firsthand the switch of my newborn brother. A stranger's baby was placed into my brother's crib. 2 decades later, an unkempt young man showed up at my parents' home, weeping uncontrollably and asserting that he was their biological son. To my astonishment, he addressed me as his older brother in front of others. However, behind my back, he brazenly took my fiancée. But that wasn't the end of it. Together, they secretly plotted to take control of the Wong family's wealth without any remorse. What they failed to realize was that back then, I had quietly returned my brother without causing any disturbance. Upon returning from an overseas business trip, I sensed something was off at home. My parents seemed unsettled, and the house was unnervingly silent. Clutching the gifts I had brought for the family, I inquired, "Where's Noah? It's the weekend, and he hasn't come home this week." Noah, my younger brother, 5 years my junior, was a sophomore at a local university and usually returned home on weekends unless something urgent arose. I imagined his typical greeting, probably sneaking up behind the door to surprise me, then insisting, "Bro, let's play some games together." Instead of him, I was greeted by my quiet parents. My father gestured me over and said, "Lucas, come here. Your mother and I need to talk to you about something very important." As the eldest son, I had taken over the family business after starting college. The Wang family was undeniably prestigious, boasting an extensive family tree with several notable figures in its history. My parents' generation and our relatives were all affluent. Our family businesses awaited inheritance by Noah and me, ensuring our financial stability. I moved closer, confused, and asked, "What's going on with you two? Acting all secretive? Did Noah get into trouble again?" Noah had always been rebellious and difficult to manage. During his middle school years, I frequently had to clean up his messes. However, he wasn't someone who bullied others. Though he had a short temper, he only directed it at those who provoked him. He believed in confronting anyone who crossed him, regardless of their age or gender, prioritizing fairness. My mother motioned for me to sit, her expression complex as she said, "No, it's much worse than that." Completely baffled, I wondered if there was something more serious than Noah causing issues. Cautiously, I asked, "Are we bankrupt? Which business is failing? Our family has investments in numerous industries, making it hard to identify the problematic one." My father shook his head, his face etched with worry, and said, "Lucas, have you ever considered that Noah might not be our child?" I was speechless. Turning to my mother, I asked, "Mom, did you ever do something wrong when you were younger?" Before she could answer, my father slapped me on the head. He yelled, "What kind of nonsense are you thinking?" His voice grew louder as he continued, "What I mean is, what if Noah isn't mine? What if he's not your mother's son either?" I responded firmly, "That's impossible." Hearing my response, my mother also looked troubled and said, "Yeah, how could the child we've raised for 20 years not be ours?" Their strange behavior left me crossing my arms and leaning back, prompting me to ask, "What's going on? Who's saying Noah isn't our son?" During my week-long business trip, I learned about the bizarre events that had unfolded. A few days prior, a disheveled 20-year-old man had appeared before my parents, crying and clinging to my father's leg, declaring, "Mom, Dad, I am your real son. Your current youngest son, Noah, is a fake. His biological mother swapped us at birth." Rubbing my forehead in disbelief, I questioned, "So you're telling me a random person shows up claiming to be your real son and you believe him?" The situation gave me a headache. I continued, "Give me your phone. I want to check if you've received any scam messages." My mother shook her head, explaining, "But he accurately described the date and time of Noah's birth, even knowing the hospital and the doctor who attended him." I replied, "That just means the scammer was well prepared. Besides, this information isn't classified. It wouldn't be surprising if someone remembered or happened to know about it." My mother added, "We didn't believe him at first, but then he showed the bracelet your grandma gave Noah when he was born." My father interjected, "You were still young and might not remember, but your grandma specially made bracelets for both you and Noah from Bodhi seeds. Noah's current bracelet is a replacement, but the original one, the one your grandma placed in his crib, disappeared at some point." Their words triggered distant memories from the day Noah was born. I was 5, just returning from kindergarten to an empty house except for the nanny. I wanted to find my parents, but was told they had gone to the hospital to deliver my sibling. I likely visited Noah the next evening, more than 10 hours after his birth. While I don't recall the exact security measures at the hospital 2 decades ago, I do remember the prevalence of human traffickers who were known to steal babies directly from hospitals. My father had received an urgent work call and had to leave to handle it. Our relatives, initially excited about the new baby, went silent once my mother became too exhausted and needed rest. The nanny was supposed to watch over the babies, but I can't remember why she left the room at that time. I tiptoed to the crib to see my little brother. He wasn't crying. His lips were slightly curled into a calm, composed smile. He looked handsome, much like me. After staring at him for a while, I grew tired. The dim light in the room made me feel the need to rest. For some reason, I found my mother's coat hanging on the rack to be warm and inviting. So I draped it over myself, leaned against the bed, and fell asleep. Suddenly, the sound of a door opening jolted me awake. At first, I thought it was my father returning, but I quickly realized it wasn't. A woman entered the room, not the nanny, nor a relative or family friend. She was carrying something, and upon closer inspection, I saw she was holding a baby. She gently placed the baby down, then quietly picked up my brother and left. Perhaps it was the dim lighting, and since I was small and hidden under my mother's coat, she didn't notice me. I watched in silence, still half asleep, wondering if I was dreaming. When the soft sound of the door closing reached my ears, I quickly approached the crib. Despite newborns looking similar, the clothes this baby wore matched those my brother had been dressed in. After staring at Noah for so long, how could I not recognize him? He had been swapped. Realizing something was wrong, I tried to wake my mother, but her breathing was steady and she wouldn't wake up. I opened the door and saw the woman turning the corner. I immediately followed her into another room, where her muttering was barely audible, but I noted the room number. Soon after, a man entered, and the two began arguing. He seemed to have taken something from her, prompting her to chase after him. That's when I acted. I swiftly opened the door, snuck in, and saw my brother in the crib. I was certain it was Noah. Carefully, I picked him up and took him back to my mother's room. Along the way, Noah nodded and pouted, acting serious, like a leader giving approval. Once I returned him, I took the stranger's baby and brought him to the other room. The nanny was shocked to see me carrying Noah, and later, my father scolded me for causing trouble. My mother woke up a few hours later, and since nothing seemed amiss, I didn't worry further. The entire incident was hazy in my memory, and later, I even thought it was just a dream. Now, someone was using the Bodhi seed bracelet my grandmother gave Noah to claim kinship. My memories ended, and I wasn't sure if all the details were accurate. If it was just a dream, Noah hadn't been swapped. If not, then I had indeed swapped him back. I asked, "Where is the guy who came to claim to be our son?" My mother whispered, "We told him to stay at the house on the east side of the lake." I frowned. "Have you done a paternity test? You just let him stay at our house." My mother lowered her head, and I didn't dare say more. My father also looked down, fearful of the possibility. If the son they had raised for 20 years wasn't truly theirs, how could they break the bond they had? If their real son had been missing for 2 decades, how could they compensate for those lost years? I kept my thoughts to myself. Even though I believed Noah was my real brother, memories from when I was 5 weren't entirely reliable. Only a paternity test could provide definitive proof. Quickly, I proposed, "Let's do this. We'll get him a paternity test as soon as possible. Until the results come in, there's no need to inform Noah. No one would want to see their family member doubting their bloodline." My parents agreed with the plan, understanding that despite their hesitation, the matter needed resolution as soon as possible. My mother anxiously asked, "What if the test shows a match?" I glanced at my phone, reading a work email, and responded casually, "We'll report the trafficker to the police, bring him back, and compensate for the lost time. Noah can stay with me. Worst case, he's already capable of taking care of himself. But I added softly, I still think this whole thing is a sham, but life always surprises you faster than you expect. The very next day, I received a call saying, Lucas, something happened. Completely bewildered, especially since it was Sunday and I was supposed to rest, but I didn't. Typically, parents aren't called to school, but today was different. Noah had gotten into a fight at school. A friend of his had called to warn me that Noah didn't want our parents to know. I was at a loss for words. Who could have anticipated that despite being in college, Noah still had such a temper? When I arrived at the busy police station, I saw Noah, furious, surrounded by his friends and a very young counselor, probably just a few years older than me. They had come to the police station to address the school fight. My peaceful weekend was officially ruined. I called out, Noah. The angry young man turned around upon seeing me and rushed over as if seeking my intervention. Bro, you're finally here. I gave him a quick assessment. Noticing there were no serious injuries, just a red hand, I asked, What's this about you fighting again? You're not a teenager anymore. Can't you be a bit more mature? Look at me. I'm calm under pressure, unaffected by anything. Learn from me. How can I feel at ease when you're like this? He interrupted loudly. Bro, stop with the lecture. Ava's been sneaking around with some guy from school. You've been cheated on. I was speechless. Ava, my fiance. That's when I saw her in the crowd, the woman I hadn't seen in over a week. I didn't have specific needs regarding relationships. My upbringing had shaped my views. When selecting a partner, her family background was paramount to me. Ava was the fiance I had chosen personally. She came from a family of similar status, was exceptionally beautiful, and our parents were pleased with the match. However, we didn't share the same values. For instance, she often professed a desire to be independent and live for herself, but never took steps to improve herself. Instead, she expected me to cater to her whims and finance her hobbies. I refused to be manipulated, resulting in her frequently criticizing me for being stubborn and not knowing how to please women. But this bothered me little. Her family background was more important than shared values. I couldn't expect everyone to think as I did. I asked, Ava, what's going on? My gaze landed on this beautiful yet distressed girl. She had a noticeable slap mark on her pale cheek, and her pure white dress was dirt-stained, giving her a tragic look. Beside Ava stood a stranger, a short, plain man who looked at her with deep affection. Ava, her face flushed, bit her lip and said, Lucas, your brother is talking nonsense. I was just accompanying a friend to the school, and he came over and started hitting me without knowing the full story. Noah stepped forward, pointing at Ava, shouting, You're lying. What kind of friend hugs and cuddles like that? That's not what friends do. I'll tell you, if you dare put a green hat on my brother, I won't let you off the hook. Noah looked furious, as if ready to strike again. I addressed them calmly. So, this is your friend. Which family does he come from? I've never seen him before. Up to this point, my emotions were under control, and my first thought was that this man might be a wealthy second-generation heir. Although it's common for affluent young people to complain about lacking love despite their wealth, their comfortable lives made happiness another matter. Most of our friends came from similar circles, but Ava seemed to hesitate before answering. He's not from a rich family. He's just a friend I met at a restaurant. The term friend was peculiar. Someone you'd met only once could be considered a friend. Someone who hugged and held you could be called a friend. I didn't press the issue, but my brother clearly disapproved of Ava's explanation. He retorted, What kind of friend is that close? Do you have no shame? It was evident that Noah didn't approve of our engagement. He had opposed it from the start. Before we were engaged, Ava's reputation was already questionable, with rumors of promiscuity, numerous boyfriends, and constant cheating. But those indulgent heirs in wealthy families seemed to revel in such drama, so it wasn't surprising they were drawn to someone like Ava. For me, engagement and marriage were different. Our families had been collaborating on a project for over 2 years, with about 6 months remaining. I believed there was no rush and that we could decide after the project concluded. But Noah wasn't aware of this and thought I was genuinely in love with Ava. Once the counselor and police officers realized we were all acquainted, they sighed in relief and suggested, "Since this is a personal issue, it's best to resolve it privately. No more fighting, please." Ava's decision to involve the police seemed impulsive. She knew that escalating the situation wouldn't benefit anyone, especially since she was in the wrong. She should have agreed to settle things quietly, but instead, she angrily pointed at Noah and demanded, "Solve it unless he apologizes to me." That was crossing the line, I thought. Lowering my head to suppress the urge to scold my brother, I calmly asked, "Ava, are you asking my brother to apologize for attacking you because you were caught cheating?" Before she could respond, the men beside her stepped forward, attempting to explain. "Bro, Ava and I aren't like that. Please don't misunderstand." I scoffed, gesturing towards the irate Noah, and said, "This guy here, stop trying to get close to me. My brother is right here, so don't try to butter me up." Finally, Ava spoke up, sounding relieved. "Lucas, how long are you going to keep pretending this guy is your brother? Didn't your parents tell you? Noah is not your real brother. He's the real one," pointing at the men beside her. I froze, shifting my gaze between Ava and the men, beginning to suspect his true identity. Before I could respond, Noah spoke first, his voice edged with anger. "Looks like I didn't hit you hard enough. You're making up all these stories. So now, I'm not your real brother. Then who is?" In a loving family, no one would imagine that their child wasn't their biological offspring or that their brother wasn't truly theirs. Yet here, such absurd claims were being made. I paused as Ava and Noah continued arguing. Ava seemed to harbor deep resentment towards Noah, pointing at him and saying, "You don't know, do you, Noah? Your real mother switched you and Steve when you two were born. You're not a member of the Wong family." Steve. Steve, that name. My parents had mentioned that the person claiming to be a long-lost relative was named Steve. I never expected this individual to be attending the same university as Noah. Rubbing my temples, I tried to process the situation. What role did Ava play in all this? At that moment, we were still at the police station, with Noah's counselor and other officers present, along with some of Noah's friends from our social circle. Initially, I hadn't planned to reveal the truth to Noah until everything was clarified, but now it seemed more people knew about it than I had anticipated. Noah, still doubtful of Ava's claims, clenched his fists and turned to me. He asked, "Is what she said true?" I knew Noah as well as he knew me. In those few seconds, he was undoubtedly trying to read my expression to discern the truth. My brief silence was enough to answer him. His clenched fists gradually relaxed, and he stood there, stunned, struggling to comprehend the absurdity of the situation. I stared coldly at Ava, but before I could speak, Steve, standing beside her, spoke up again. "Bro, I'm your real brother. I met Ava by chance. When I heard she knew you and your parents, I asked her to help me contact them." Now it made sense. I had always wondered how Steve managed to reach my parents without my knowledge. Steve was visibly filled with resentment and hatred. He despised Noah and resented that someone else had been living the life he should have had for the past 20 years. Despite his attempts to hide it, a hint of his hatred was still evident. I said, "I remember my parents scheduled a paternity test with you for tomorrow. Until the results are in, I have no reason to believe you're my real brother." This essentially confirmed what Ava had said. Noah's expression was indescribable. His emotions were all over the place, and he didn't know how to react to this revelation. His friends looked at us with wide eyes, clearly shocked by what they were hearing. I continued, "Ava, no matter how much you argue, this has nothing to do with you. Why are you interfering?" Ava reacted strongly, angrily retorting, "Lucas, I must have been blind to be with you. I thought you were just cold and overly rational, not knowing how to be considerate towards girls. But I never imagined you'd be so heartless, rejecting your own brother and siding with an outsider like this. Cold, maybe. I wasn't about to be like her exes, pampering her every whim. I was born into a wealthy family, but that didn't mean I was going to be a pushover for any woman. Compared to the back-and-forth struggles among the younger generation in the Liu family, The Wong family estate was carried forward solely by Noah and me. From a young age, we were taught to have the final say. So I said, Ava, are you crazy or am I? Whether he's my real brother or not, it doesn't change the fact that you cheated. So what? Should I side with you two in your affair instead of with Noah? She was speechless. When she finally tried to respond, I had already turned to Noah and said, Noah, let's go home. On our way back, I called my parents to inform them about what had happened and reminded them to bring someone for the test the next day. Noah was completely despondent, silent, much like the day he discovered in middle school that his favorite meat floss sandwich actually contained meat. His worldview had collapsed then, and it felt like history was repeating itself. Upon arriving home, our parents were there, greeting us and offering dinner while trying to appear normal. However, Noah was quieter than usual and didn't say much, which was driving me crazy. Later that night, just as I was about to sleep, I heard a knock on my bedroom door. "Come in," I called out. The door opened and my 20-year-old brother stood there holding his gaming laptop, the same one I had given him when he was 18 and started university. I had told him he needed to balance work and rest, so he spent the entire summer dragging me into gaming sessions, from co-op single-player games to online team battles. We were as close as brothers could be. I looked up, feeling momentarily transported back to that summer. As he held his laptop, ready to play all night with me, he hesitantly asked, "Bro, I found a new game. Want to play together?" Although I hadn't stayed up late in a long time, I still responded, "Come in." Noah's face showed a faint, barely noticeable flicker of joy. He quickly set up the laptop, bringing in snacks and drinks. He didn't say much, as if he was only there to play, but his usually chatty nature, always cracking jokes and teasing me while gaming, was nowhere to be seen. Tonight, he was unusually quiet, almost cautious. He didn't take any equipment, nor did he poke fun at me like usual. It had been a long time since I'd seen him so serious. After a while, as we defeated a boss and I was picking up loot, he suddenly spoke in a low voice. "Bro." I replied, "What's up?" He asked, "What if I'm really not your real brother?" I responded, "You are." He continued, "I mean, what if?" I firmly patted him on the back of his head and said, "There's no what if." We had arranged to take Steve for the paternity test and I went to pick him up. However, upon entering his apartment, I was surprised to see Ava there, having breakfast with him. When they saw us, both looked flustered, their actions betraying their nervousness. My father's face darkened as he asked, "Ava, what are you doing here?" Yesterday, I had mentioned Ava to my parents, but hadn't provided details, so they only knew her as a friend. Ava, not daring to act up in front of my parents, bit her lip and said, "Uncle, Aunt, I heard you're going for the test today, so I came to wait for you here at Steve's. After all, we're all going to be family eventually." I forced a smile, wondering what tricks Steve had used to convince Ava that he was the lost Wong family son. Ava's actions were overstepping. She was still my fiancé in name, and even if she wanted to join us, there was no reason for her to be alone at Steve's place, especially since it was my parents' house. Today's agenda was private and couldn't involve outsiders, so I had to take the lead. As we drove, Steve began sharing his life story. He said his foster parents treated him terribly, his foster mother was miserly, and his foster father was an alcoholic who abused him. As he grew older, they even tried to force him to drop out of school and work. He worked hard and eventually managed to get into university. Initially, it sounded like a sad but inspiring tale of overcoming adversity, but my nature made it difficult to believe everything he was saying. Humans tend to be selective with their stories, highlighting what benefits them. So I asked, "How did you find out about your true origins?" Steve didn't seem surprised by the question, perhaps because he had already shared his story with others before. He replied, "Last year, when I went home, I accidentally saw my foster mother's phone. She had secretly taken photos of Noah and other pictures in an album labeled Good Son. I saw Noah's wrist and noticed he was wearing a bracelet that looked exactly like mine. Later, when she was drunk, she cursed and said that her son was living a life of luxury while Noah was serving her." Steve continued, I asked my foster father, and he said I was supposed to be born a few days later, but my mother insisted on delivering me that day. His story was very convincing. Steve's bracelet was real, and even my parents couldn't help but imagine the pain their real son must have endured. I asked, "Before you contacted my parents, didn't you consider getting a paternity test to confirm if you were really their son?" Steve froze and stammered, I didn't think of it. It made sense. On one side was the possibility of becoming a wealthy heir, and on the other, the reality of being neglected by a poor family. Who wouldn't subconsciously avoid the latter? Suddenly, Ava interjected. "Lucas, why are you questioning your brother so much? Whether or not he's your real brother is determined by blood. You shouldn't be so harsh just because you get along with Noah." I smiled and replied, "That's right. It's determined by blood. Then let the paternity test decide." The results of the paternity test were expected to take 3 days. The following day, we attended a banquet celebrating Sue's little princess turning 18, to which our entire family was invited. Our two families had some connections, so attendance was necessary. My brother had a closer relationship with the birthday girl, being only 2 years younger. While our parents mingled with Sue's elders, I exchanged a few pleasantries and then found a quiet corner to drink. Noah had already been pulled aside by the birthday girl for a private conversation. He seemed off in the past few days. Even when I invited him to play games, he wasn't interested. Whenever I asked what was wrong, he simply said nothing. A light, melodious voice called out from behind me, "Lucas." Turning around, I saw who it was. I greeted her politely. "Miss Sue, long time no see." Anna was wearing a black knitted dress. The low-cut design highlighted her collarbones, while the fitted waist and hip-hugging style accentuated her curves. She approached me gracefully, casually brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, revealing her almost perfect face. Her makeup was impeccable, her features striking, and her mischievous eyes sparkled with an alluring light. In the next moment, she moved too close for comfort. She leaned casually against the railing beside me, then teasingly raised her hand near my neck, only to playfully snatch the handkerchief from my pocket. I grabbed her wrist, my voice taking on a warning tone. "Anna." She blinked, then returned the handkerchief with a sly grin. She tiptoed to my ear and whispered in a sweet, familiar voice, "I saw a guy bring your fiancé in just now. He seemed like he wanted to make a move on your brother." I asked, "What does that have to do with you?" She smiled lightly and said, "I also saw that guy put his arm around Ava's shoulders. You used to get jealous whenever others looked at me. So, has your possessiveness been cured?" I was speechless. A proper ex should remain silent. Anna and I had been together back in college just after we turned 18. It was my first serious relationship, and I had invested a lot emotionally. She wasn't any less possessive than I was. We broke up due to some conflicts, and she went abroad, losing contact thereafter. Both of us were ambitious and unwilling to bow to anyone, especially regarding our careers. So, when she left the country, I didn't try to stop her. But the night I got engaged to Ava last year, she called me. I answered, but neither of us said anything at first. After a long pause, she finally asked, "Do you like her?" I replied, "That has nothing to do with Miss Sue." Anna snorted on the other end and confidently said, "If she's not the one you like, you won't last long." I hung up, not bothering to argue. Now, it seemed she had been right. This engagement might not even last 2 years. I asked, "When did you come back to the country?" Anna replied, "I just landed this morning." It seemed she had put considerable effort into attending her sister's coming-of-age celebration. I said, "Miss Sue, I need to go check on something downstairs. I'll excuse myself for now." From where I was standing, I could see some commotion below. However, she didn't let go of my arm, instead pulling herself closer to me. She murmured, "Don't go, it's fine. There are security guards downstairs. They won't dare to do anything." I looked down at her and asked, "Anna, what do you mean? Are you trying to be the other woman?" She responded, Ava and you don't match. The Liu family is very patriarchal, and she has a younger brother and even a cousin. Marrying you is just her way of finding someone to depend on for the future, keeping her luxurious lifestyle intact. She won't help your career in any way. So why would you want to team up with an unfaithful partner like her? She continued, I'm different. In terms of views, my grandfather never valued sons over daughters. In terms of his career, Sue matches the capabilities of the Liu family. When it comes to family matters, I've only been with you once, and I maintain a much cleaner image than she does. I was left speechless. It was evident that going out had spoiled her, making her blunt and tactless. I pushed Anna away and went downstairs to assess the situation, but I arrived too late. The earlier confrontation seemed to have subsided for the moment. People around me stared in surprise, hesitating to speak as if they wanted to ask something but lacked the courage. As I moved through the crowd, I faintly heard my name and my brother's, intertwined with whispers about the fake young master and various rumors. Ava had actually brought Steve to Anna's coming-of-age party. Prior to this, rumors about Noah and Steve's identities had already circulated, likely initiated by Ava or perhaps some of Noah's acquaintances. Regardless of the origin, Ava was to blame. I couldn't locate my parents, and my brother was probably still with the birthday girl. So I proceeded to the lounge where the hallway was carpeted, and my footsteps were silent. Passing a door slightly ajar, I heard Ava's voice inside, choked with sobs. Steve, were all those times you said you liked me a lie? She cried. Steve responded, I do like you, but you're still my brother's fiance. Ava continued, tearfully questioning, why do you call him brother? Does he even see you as a younger brother? He's a cold-blooded monster. Can't you see that? Lucas doesn't like me, and I never liked him either. Our engagement was forced by our families. I'm like a puppet, compelled to marry a stranger I don't even love. Steve replied, would your parents ever agree to marry you to me? Ava ceased crying and responded seriously. Steve, our engagement is for family business. You're from the Wong family. If you return to the Wong family, I could be with you too. Ava's words reminded me of the period shortly after our engagement last year. Every day, she would message me, requesting to go to movies, shop, pick her up and drop her off at work, buy her cars, houses, and jewelry, and even charter a yacht to take her out to sea. She certainly didn't seem uninterested back then, but I wasn't easily swayed. I told her directly that this was a political marriage, not a sugar daddy arrangement. It was about mutual benefits, not one-sided sacrifices. After that, she became distant towards me. Now, I understood what Anna had mentioned. Ava wasn't genuinely interested in me. She was merely seeking someone willing to spend money on her, someone who would play the role of a simp. Internally, Ito, who thought he had won the girl's heart, was still dreaming of a wonderful future with Ava. I turned and quietly left the scene. As I turned, I noticed Anna standing nearby, her eyes filled with a knowing smile. After exiting the hallway, Anna teased, seems like things are pretty lively at your place lately. I sneered, if you want a good show, go to the theater. Anna asked, when are you going to call off the engagement? I turned to her and responded, when did I say I'm calling off the engagement? Even if I do, what does it have to do with you? She replied, a mistress has to be prepared to take the throne at any time. She then hugged my arm and leaned her shoulder against me. I was speechless. A trip abroad had clearly lowered her moral standards. I dragged my disoriented brother Noah back home from the birthday girl's room. I patted him on the shoulder and said, what's there to worry about? I've told you 100 times, you're my brother. Noah sighed deeply, looking utterly defeated. Bro, what if it's not true? You didn't see how Ava and Steve were acting earlier. They definitely have something going on. If Steve is really your brother, once he returns to the Wong family, he and Ava could team up to fight for the family fortune. What if, in the end, you get kicked out too? What will you do then? Before I could respond, he gave me a dark look and added, if that happens, you better be ready to send me some prison meals. I was about to say something when I slapped the back of his head and said, what's this? Don't you want to play games with your brother anymore? Stop coming up with these crazy ideas. People's hearts are often biased. The Wong family had too many assets. There was more than enough to go around for both Noah and me. He was playful and hadn't yet focused on managing the company. We weren't in a hurry for him to assume that role. The plan was to let him gradually take on more responsibility after he graduated from college. I rubbed the back of his head and sighed. In 2 days, the test results will come out. You're definitely my brother. Both my parents and Noah didn't understand where my confidence came from. I couldn't explain the memories I had from when I was 5, so I was leaving it to the paternity test to silence everyone. Noah might think I supported Steve and my parents doing the paternity test because I had doubts, but that wasn't the case. It was the simplest way to resolve this issue. Some people needed to face the consequences of their actions, even if they hadn't caused any direct harm to my family in the past 20 years. However, I had underestimated the depths of human malice. The day Noah returned to school, something happened to him there as well. A friend of his, a university professor, forwarded me a post from their school's social wall. The post read, "A second-year finance major has a really steady mentality. He usually lives in luxury, but it turns out he's a fake young master who's been living off someone else's fortune. How can he still have the nerve to attend classes? Did he never think that the real young master, who was switched at birth 20 years ago, would end up studying at the same university as him? This imposter has enjoyed 20 years of wealth and glory," my friend said. "Lucas, this sounds like Noah. Your family situation is already spreading at school. This doesn't seem right." It didn't seem right. Normally, people wouldn't spread rumors about something that could negatively impact them, so it wasn't likely to be Noah. It must have been Steve. My friend, being a teacher, knew many students. Soon enough, I saw people spreading rumors, trying to uncover the identity of the fake young master. I asked him to contact the school to have the post deleted, considering it a favor. "I'll treat you to dinner sometime," he laughed and said. "This doesn't count as a favor. These unverified rumors shouldn't even be posted in the first place. I'll contact the teachers and have them remove it." He added, "But even if it's deleted, it probably won't stop the gossip." I understood. What I didn't grasp was why, if they were so sure they had been switched at birth, they couldn't just wait patiently for the paternity test results. I took my parents to the house on the east side of the lake to meet Steve. After the previous night, I had Noah take a leave and go home. Even without solid proof, some people had already believed the story about the fake young master through online gossip. Noah was the president of the school's weightlifting club, and his contact information wasn't a secret. Once it was leaked by someone with ulterior motives, he began receiving constant harassment starting the night before. People added him as a friend to insult him or even called him to curse at him. It got him so worked up that he almost wanted to meet someone offline to fight, so I had him take leave and confiscated his phone. Now he's stuck at home playing on his computer to kill time. I don't think these people, including Steve, should be taught a lesson. But Noah tends to resort to violence when confronted, which isn't wise. A knife needs a sheath, and I'm my brother's sheath. When Steve saw me and my parents, he immediately smiled and said, "Mom, Dad, big brother, you came to see me." His acceptance of his new family was much quicker than I expected. My parents were still not accustomed to the way he addressed them and wanted to say something but feared it would make him uncomfortable. As parents, they hadn't really done anything wrong. But until the paternity test results came out, they were still clinging to that lingering uncertainty, worried. Only I wasn't affected by it. After a few pleasantries, I calmly asked, "Steve, have you seen anything on the school's social wall?" His face stiffened for a moment before he asked in an unclear tone, "No, why? What's wrong, big brother?" I explained, "Someone anonymously posted about you and Noah on your school's social wall, completely humiliating him. It's like they hate him. I've had the post deleted, but some people have already traced it back and started insulting him. Do you know about this?" I kept an eye on Steve's expression. By the second half of our conversation, his eyes didn't seem entirely natural, perhaps even showing a hint of satisfaction. Steve's face reddened and he gritted his teeth, saying, "I had no idea about this, big brother." "Are you implying that I posted it on the social wall? Is that the kind of person you think I am in your hearts?" My mom spoke up first, asking, "Steve, Lucas means to ask if you've told any classmates or friends about this." His gaze flickered for a moment. After a long pause, he quietly said, "I mentioned it to my roommate before. Maybe they were just standing up for me." I had checked the comments on that social wall post, and it was indeed possible that some of them were from people close to him. My dad said, "Until the paternity test results come out, it's too hasty to spread this information." He thought about it for a while before adding this. It wasn't a harsh statement, but it seemed to resonate with Steve. He suddenly stood up, trembling, his fists clenched and shaking uncontrollably. "Dad, do you also suspect that I did this on purpose? Whether it was intentional or not? Noah stole 20 years of my life. I should have been raised by you, to be your son and brother. Shouldn't I resent him?" My dad sighed and said, "But even if you two were switched at birth 20 years ago, Noah was just a newborn at the time. He couldn't control his life and didn't even know his own identity. The ones you should be resentful of are the ones who caused all of this, and the parents who failed to protect you, which is us." Steve's emotions became even more agitated, and his whole body trembled as he gasped. "But he's the one who benefited from it all, even now. You still treat him like your own son, don't you? Everything he has should have been mine." "Why?" His emotions were so raw and genuine that even my parents could tell he wasn't lying. It was the truth. Steve had been consumed by the story of his swapped life. His genuine resentment was directed at the person who had lived the 20 years he should have had, as well as the culprits behind it all. "What are you doing?" A woman's voice suddenly rang out from behind. I hadn't noticed when Ava had entered the room. She hurried over to support Steve, who was trembling uncontrollably. Seeing Steve's state, she began crying and said, "Mr. and Mrs. Wong, how can you treat Steve like this? He's been through so much outside. Did you even ask about it? Now that he's finally back home, not only does he not feel the warmth of a family, but you're also interrogating him. Steve doesn't owe you anything." Ava's tears fell like rain, one after another, as if she were a weeping flower. Steve seemed to play along with her, sighing and comforting her. "It's okay, Ava. I'm used to it." I couldn't be bothered to listen to their act. I directly interrupted. "Steve, did you tell Ava the password to this house?" I asked because I was certain I had locked the door when I came in. Both of them froze for a moment at the mention of the password. My parents also finally reacted to the awkwardness of Ava's sudden appearance. She had accompanied us for the paternity test earlier, and now here she was again, out of nowhere. It was hard not to make assumptions. My mom furrowed her brow and asked, "Ava, how did you get here?" Ava remained silent, and Steve quickly interjected, "Mom, I told Ava I wasn't used to being here before, and she said she'd come to check on me for my brother since she's my brother's fiance and we'll be family. I thought it was only right to tell her." My parents weren't fools, and although they were caught in an awkward situation with their son, they weren't easily deceived. I smiled and said, "So you know she's my fiancée. She doesn't even know the password to my place but knows yours. Does that seem reasonable to you?" Ava clearly felt insulted. She snapped at me. "Lucas, how can you slander me like that? Steve and I are completely innocent. I was just trying to help repair the relationship between you brothers. Since you clearly don't care about him, that's why I came to check on him." Innocent. They had already made their commitment to each other. I lightly responded, "Is that so? I don't believe it." I quickly added before they could say anything, "How about I take a look at your chat history?" The two of them fell silent. After a long pause, Ava pulled out a large card and said, "Lucas, the most important thing in a marriage is trust. Checking someone's phone is a sign of distrust and an insult. I'll let you see our chat history, but if you find nothing, I'll break off the engagement and the dowry won't be refunded." I asked, confused, "And what if there is something?" She replied, "If that's the case, I'll return the dowry and agree to end the engagement." I was speechless, realizing that in the end she wouldn't lose anything. If she cheated, the punishment was simply returning what was mine. I rubbed my temples and said, "Fine, bring it to me. Let's show everyone." She retorted, "Checking my phone shows a lack of trust. If you don't trust me, then just end the engagement." Why the need for humiliation? What a load of nonsense. I responded, Are you trying to play both sides? Fine, I'll annul the marriage and you won't get to keep the dowry. I turned to my parents and said, Mom, Dad, call Uncle Lou and his family. Let's resolve this today so we don't ruin anyone's chance at marriage. My parents had clearly realized that Ava wasn't a good person, and with the possibility that Steve might be their son and Ava was clearly entangled with him, they didn't hesitate to address the issue. At their age, could they not see through Ava's intentions? Ava had originally mentioned it casually, but when she saw my parents agree and start calling her family, she froze in place. Then, after seeing Steve's expression, she seemed to decide not to stop them. The Lou family wasn't willing to break off the engagement, but I'm not sure what Ava said to them. When they met us, their attitudes suddenly became warm and friendly. They said, since the two children are no longer interested in each other, let's call off the engagement. In the future, they can both marry whoever they choose. Ava's mother also didn't show much change in her attitude toward us. She smiled at my parents and said, it's unfortunate that we won't become one family, but I hope our two families will have more chances to work together in the future. It was all just polite conversation. Both sides maintained a friendly tone when it came to matters of cooperation. Breaking off the engagement was actually a very simple matter. Both parties came to an agreement and announced it to friends and family. That night, after the engagement was officially called off, I received a phone call from Anna. Wong, I heard you're single now, I replied. Yeah, and what does that have to do with you? The woman on the other end of the line laughed lightly and said, of course it has to do with me. Now that the spot's open, I'm aiming to be the new mistress. Before I could respond, she suddenly switched to a high-pitched voice and said, wait until you're done with things at home. Come out and have dinner with me, okay? It's been so long since we've eaten together. I really miss you, Wong. I was speechless. This woman used to be so arrogant. Where did she learn to act like this? I hung up the phone. The next day, the paternity test results came out. We decided to go to the testing center ourselves to obtain the official paper report and reveal the truth right there. Of course, all the involved parties had to be present. Me, my parents, Noah, Steve, and Ava, who for some reason also followed along, almost as if she wanted to support Steve. It didn't matter. My parents and Noah were both nervous, as if that report would shatter the peace and harmony of our family. When the results were handed to me, everyone's gaze immediately focused on the paper. I looked at Steve and calmly said, Steve, this is the paternity test report from a certified institution. There's no possibility of forgery. You should understand that, right? Steve didn't understand why I said that, but he nodded in agreement. I understand. Ava sneered and said, Lucas, stop dragging it out. Just open it. It was clear that she was eager to marry into the Wong family. Just as I was about to open it, a disheveled middle-aged woman suddenly barged in. She scanned the room before locking her gaze on Steve, rushing forward and attempting to hit him. You ungrateful child! How dare you abandon your real parents and fight for someone else's parents? The woman slapped Steve across the face without warning. As she raised her hand for a second strike, Steve's eyes flashed with fury. He kicked her to the ground and followed with 2 more heavy blows. In the next second, my parents rushed over to stop him, asking, Steve, calm down. Who is she? Why did she hit you? The middle-aged woman raised her head, her sharp gaze unmistakable as she said, I'm his mother. Steve scoffed. You call yourself a mother? You're nothing but a human trafficker. My parents finally understood what was happening. The woman spat. Steve, you good for nothing. Come home right now. Don't make me call your father to slap some sense into you. You dream too much. You sit around all day doing nothing, thinking you're some rich young master. I'll tell you, our family's been poor for generations, and you're no different. You don't deserve anything. Do you hear me? Go to the factory and work like your father did. My parents stared at her as if trying to recall if they'd ever met someone like her before. After a moment, they shook their heads, indicating they didn't know her, meaning there was no grudge between them. I studied the woman's face, and even after 20 years, couldn't recall her clearly. Her shape, her features, everything about her was unfamiliar. It dawned on me that this was the woman who had nearly changed my brother's and my family's destiny. The middle-aged woman wasn't unattractive and probably looked good when she was younger. I don't know if it was due to my bias, but I thought her features bore some resemblance to Steve's. However, overall, it wasn't very noticeable. Steve, on the other hand, had inherited the best qualities from both his parents and had a decent appearance. The woman said to my parents, "This useless boy's lost his mind over money. He's my son. How could he possibly be yours?" My parents were unable to comprehend how a mother could call her own son a waste. My mom asked, "Then what about that bracelet of his?" The woman quickly replied, "I found it a long time ago. I thought it was fake, so I just put it in a drawer. I didn't know he stole it." Steve spat on the ground and, with a triumphant glint in his eyes, laughed loudly. "Keep making things up. I heard you say it yourself. You swapped me with a rich family's child. You said you learned about their background during the prenatal checkup and decided to switch us. The paternity test is out now. Nothing you say can change that. All your scheming has been for nothing." He wanted the woman who had altered his life to watch her lie unravel before everyone. Seeing her plans fall apart brought him satisfaction. The middle-aged woman, upon hearing this, looked at the report in my hand with a defensive expression. She immediately tried to cover up. "I've always said he's my real son. Why don't you believe me? Why would I raise him if he's not my son? I could have just dumped him somewhere." If my father hadn't stopped Steve, he would have probably used the woman as a punching bag by now. Steve's eyes burned with fury as he roared, "Shut up! You couldn't have had a child. You needed someone to support you in your old age." The woman, enraged by the truth, lunged at Steve but was stopped, thinking about how she had once swapped babies and even considered abandoning him. My gaze turned cold. I said, "Lady, are you sure Steve's your biological son?" I pointed toward Noah and added, "Because according to him, my brother seems to be your real son." Noah, who was being pointed out, also gave the woman a fierce look. It was clear that he was burning with anger as well. Of course, who could feel any warmth toward a woman who had abused her own son, calling him names and treating him badly? I noticed that when the woman looked at Noah, the malice in her gaze toward Steve seemed to fade. Perhaps, after all these years, she hadn't realized something was wrong. I said indifferently, "Since everyone's here, let's reveal the result." The woman instinctively reached for the paternity test report in my hand, but I moved it away. She screamed, "I've told you Steve is my son. Why do you need a paternity test report in my hand?" I moved it away. She screamed, "I've told you Steve is my son. Why do you need a paternity test?" The more she insisted, the more pleased Steve and Ava seemed. While my parents and brother appeared increasingly solemn, I opened the two paternity test reports and flipped straight to the page with the results. The room fell silent for a moment. My parents asked in unison, "What does the result say?" I handed the paternity test report over and gestured for them to take a look themselves. Everyone gathered around except for Noah, the patient who refused to look at the diagnosis, and the woman who kept insisting Steve was her biological son. The first to look at it were my parents. After reading it, their expressions tightened, and they said nothing. The report was then passed to Steve and Ava, who were eager to see the results. After focusing on the test results, both looked at each other, their faces full of disbelief. They spoke in unison. "How is this possible?" Steve couldn't accept the truth. He flipped through the two paternity test reports repeatedly, staring at the two lines of text. After a long pause, he suddenly looked up at me, asking angrily, "Did you not want me to go back home and deliberately tamper with the results?" Then he quickly turned to Noah, his voice sharp. "It must be you. You're afraid I'll come back and take everything you have, so you messed with the results." "Right." Noah looked completely confused. The paternity test report fell from my hands, only to be picked up by a slightly rough hand. Moments later, another voice echoed, "How is this possible?" The middle-aged woman, who had repeatedly claimed that Steve was her biological son, read the result aloud to herself, excluding Laura as Steve's biological mother and Martin as Steve's biological father. Her temperament wasn't great to begin with, and now she was tugging at Steve's hand, either crying or laughing, saying, "You're not their child. How could you not be? How could you possibly be my son?" I couldn't help but think to myself, if he were truly your biological son, you wouldn't be so upset right now. Noah, who had finally gathered the courage to look at the paternity test report, glanced at it before happily jumping onto my back and exclaiming, "Old bro, he's not mine. Then I must be your real kid, right?" I smiled. Of course, I had noticed that in the past few days, my little brother had been acting strangely. The usually confident and cheerful guy was now barely interested in gaming. The three people who couldn't accept the truth were still immersed in their own worlds. At this moment, I spoke up. "Are you all wondering why the child you've been raising isn't my parents' biological son, even though you went into my mom's hospital room and swapped the baby? But now that the paternity test results are out?" As soon as I said this, everyone's gaze snapped to me, especially the middle-aged woman who was staring at me with intense focus, even though she had been lucky and hadn't let my brother end up abandoned. What if I hadn't discovered what she did back then? She had intended to harm, and should I simply pretend it never happened because she failed? Now that it has been brought to light, this bullet from 20 years ago is about to hit her squarely between the eyes. Under the gaze of the woman who had believed for so long that her biological son was living a life of wealth, I slowly smiled and said, "When you went into the hospital room back then, didn't you notice me? You froze in place." I continued, "I swapped the baby in your crib with the one in mine." It didn't matter how much resentment she had held toward children from wealthy families over the years. All of it had been unleashed on her biological son. "You're talking nonsense." The woman tried to struggle and lunge at me, but was immediately restrained by my brother, who grabbed her wrist. I turned to Steve and asked, "Do you remember when I asked you about your blood type?" He looked up at me. I said calmly, "Both of my parents are type A blood. How could they possibly have a child with type B blood, even if the swap had worked back then? My family does health checks every year. There's no way your blood type could have been hidden." Steve didn't know whether to cry or laugh. He tugged at the corner of his mouth in disbelief. After enduring years of abuse and degradation from his biological mother, he had finally found a reasonable explanation: that his mother was a wicked person, and that he had suffered all these years simply because he wasn't her biological son. He had been swapped with a wealthy family's child. Finally, he found the origin of his suffering and the reason for his twisted upbringing. But now, the truth was that he was indeed her biological son. His biological mother had raised him as someone else's child and had vented all her frustrations on him. He was pitiful, but I couldn't empathize or feel sympathy. If his blood type had been A or O and he had been swapped into my family, what would have happened to my real brother? Now Steve was living in wealth that didn't belong to him, while my family and I would have given him everything, while my real brother would have suffered. After all, who in an average family would think to do a paternity test? I called to my parents and brother to get ready to leave. As I was about to step out the door, I turned back and said, "By the way, I'll send someone to pack your things at the house in East Lake. You're moving out today, and as for the rumors and slanders against my brother, I will be having everyone involved held accountable." On the way back, my mom chided me. "Lucas, I can't believe you didn't tell me and your dad about such a big thing before. Were you not afraid your brother really got swapped?" My dad also chimed in, "I always praised you for being mature and responsible, but you kept your mouth shut like this. How could you keep such a thing from us? You scared me half to death." He paused for a moment, then couldn't help but add, 5 years old and already so capable, just like me." He was immediately smacked by my mom. Finally, the heavy atmosphere at home was lifted. My parents had bought a bunch of things for my brother in the past few days, thinking about how 20 years ago their son had almost been swapped out. They couldn't help but try to make up for it, considering it their oversight. Otherwise, no one would have had the opportunity to do such a thing. My dad said I had done something significant, even though it was something I did when I was 5, but they still wanted to reward me. He decided to reward me with a company. I was speechless. I seriously suspected that he and my mom were planning to retire soon. With the truth now revealed, the necessary matters were being handled. After the things at the East Lake house were packed, they were taken away. No matter what Steve said, I had already blocked and deleted him from my parents' phones. I also lectured my parents, saying, "In the future, don't bring such shady people into our house. It's a mess." My parents, feeling guilty, didn't argue. Next, I took care of Noah's phone. I had a technician track down everyone who had been insulting my brother online. Many of them were students from the same school, and some had shared screenshots from social media marketing accounts that had spread the rumors. I reported the situation to the police. Anyone involved would not get off easy. Spreading false information without verifying its truth should be a lesson. If the police couldn't handle it, I'd sue them all. My family had more than enough money to deal with this. The involvement of so many students got the attention of the school principal and other school leaders. I'm sure the calls they made to me wore out their tongues. In the end, we reached an agreement. The school's official account issued a public statement to refute the rumors and announce the punishments for the slanderers and cyberbullies. The involved students recorded apology videos, each with a written self-reflection. As for the non-student netizens, my family's legal team would handle them. My brother still wanted to finish his studies at that school, so we couldn't let it get too ugly. If he didn't want to, he could always study abroad. I didn't really care about Steve's situation, but I couldn't avoid hearing about it from others. The incident started because of him. His roommate was the one who posted on the school's social wall, but it was true that he had spread lies. Now that everything was exposed as false, even his roommates, out of misguided enthusiasm, stepped up and took the blame. All of them were disciplined. Steve had incited others to cyberbully my brother, and the malicious backlash ended up affecting him. The students who were involved isolated him, and in the end, Steve couldn't handle the pressure and dropped out. I later heard that he went to find Ava, but Ava had always been interested in him because of his Wong family background. Her real goal was to marry into the Wong family and become a rich wife. Now that her hopes were dashed, she naturally wasn't interested in him anymore. The worst part was that Ava had lost the engagement with our family and was severely scolded by her elders. Not long ago, she even tried to reconcile with me. However, that call was answered by Anna. I watched as she put the phone on speaker, and on the other end, Ava was trying to coax and apologize in a pitiful voice. After a while, Anna laughed and said, "Sorry, our young Master Wong isn't lacking women. It's a bit too late to regret now, don't you think? After all, I'm better at holding him than you are." And with that, she hung up. Regardless of how frantic Ava sounded on the other end, I walked over and picked up the phone, only to find that Ava had already been blocked. I asked, "Jealous?" Anna snuggled into my arms and said dismissively, "Jealous her. I could tolerate her acting spoiled because of her status, but when she's not even pampered and still acting up, I couldn't stand it. She looks like someone with a developmental disorder." I was speechless. This girl could kill with just her words. "Lucas," Anna called my name. She asked, "When are you going to introduce me to your parents?" This was the girl who had shown up late one night to offer warmth. I couldn't resist the temptation, and one thing led to another. Spending a wild night together. Now she wouldn't leave my house, insisting that I had to take responsibility for her. I replied, "You already know my parents, so just go see them yourself." She snuggled into my arms and rubbed her head against me, saying, "Only if you take me." Anna had been a bit upset lately. She looked at her phone, pouting, and said, "I told your brother not to stay at home playing games all the time. I suggested he go out and hang out with you, Yochu. Young people should communicate more and go out. But he said I had ulterior motives. Can you believe him? I've been arguing and making up with you for so many years, treating him like my own brother. And this is what I get. You need to do something about it." I commented, "You really do have bad intentions. These past few nights, my brother can't even find anyone to play games with. The whole thing about getting back together with Anna wasn't kept a secret from my brother, but he had a huge reaction to it. Not long ago, when I got acute gastritis, Noah skipped class to come over and cook a hot 5-course meal for me. He was so proud of himself and said to Anna, 'No one knows how to take care of my brother better than me. We're like real brothers.'" Anna, after a moment of stunned silence, sat down and tasted Noah's cooking. In the end, she gave him a thumbs up, complimenting his culinary skills. That really pissed my brother off. Noah privately complained to me, "She's just a trashy woman. Do you remember how much you drank the day she left for studying abroad? She's the most toxic woman's heart. Ava is a perfect example. Trust your little brother on this. Women just slow us down, don't they? Isn't it better to be a real man? A Sigma male." I gave him a hard smack on the back of the head and said, "Fine, fine. I was actually going to tell you. Yochu has a game room at home with all kinds of consoles." The next second, he was gone in a flash. It seemed that, for him, the appeal of games far outweighed women. My brother is still a child, young and naive, not really understanding that there can be certain pleasures in relationships. His concerns aren't without merit, but neither Anna nor I are the type of people to lose ourselves in a relationship. After all these years, it seems she and I are the most compatible. As for marriage, it's a much more complicated matter that requires careful thought. The woman who had swapped the babies back then was named Sandra. I later investigated her and found that, in fact, she had no personal grudge against our family. But what happened back then was not a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was all part of her plan. She had been a nurse at the hospital, and being in a position to access information about expectant mothers, it was not difficult for her to learn of my mom's due date. She had purposely chosen the same day to give birth, not long after the birth. She left her job, likely because she felt guilty. For years, she had been observing my brother from some corner, convinced that the child she had manipulated and raised as her own son was her true flesh and blood. Thinking back on these years, it's a chilling thought to know someone had been watching my brother like that. However, 20 years later, there is no direct evidence that Sandra was responsible for the baby swap. I had been too young at the time to fully understand the consequences, and later I had forgotten about the whole thing. If Steve hadn't come to find me, this blurry memory would have remained buried in my mind. I saw Steve again when I was passing by a club. I saw Sandra gripping Steve's hand tightly, pleading in a low voice, "Steve, please come back with me. Okay, you're still young. Go back, repeat the year, and take the university entrance exam again. You still have a bright future ahead of you. Gambling is not for you, my child." She's lost a lot of weight since the last time I saw her. Not just normal weight loss, but it seemed like she was sick. "Get lost, you old hag. Don't tell me what to do." She continued to beg, "Steve, I was wrong. Don't ruin your life. I'm sick, and I won't live much longer. Please, come back with me." I found this scene rather amusing. The woman, it seemed, knew what the right path was all along. From a distance, I overheard Steve viciously tell his biological mother, "You should have just swapped me with someone else back then. Who would want a mother like you? You're sick, and you deserve it. This is your punishment." From an outsider's perspective, anyone who knew the full story couldn't blame Steve, but I still wouldn't forgive them. One mother, who was willing to destroy another family for her own selfish desires, and a son who had grown up in that twisted family. Steve was indeed a victim, but it wasn't necessary for things to turn out this way. If he had suppressed his desire for revenge, the results of the paternity test would only have been known to my family and him. He chose this path. Of course, the most wicked of all was Sandra, the one who had caused all of this. Later, I heard that Steve had ended up in this situation because he had grown accustomed to the extravagant world and could no longer tolerate ordinary life. After a chance victory in a casino, he realized how quickly money could come, and he became addicted to gambling, unable to pull himself out. It's a rather pitiful story. As for Ava, she never contacted Steve again. She was never the innocent, pure-hearted girl she appeared to be. Her approach to relationships was always very utilitarian. She was simply looking for someone to rely on. She knew that in the Liu family, boys were valued over girls, and her purpose there was to be married off into a good family. Only by finding a suitable husband could she maintain her dignity and position in her own family. But now, after offending the Wang family, she had completely become an abandoned child of the Liu family. Time passed slowly and calmly over the next 2 to 3 years. Lately, I had been dreaming frequently about the day my brother was born, over and over again. In my dreams, I kept reliving that day. Sometimes I would see myself lying in bed, unaware that anyone had come in, and the person who was loved and cared for by the family was someone else. I would suddenly sit up, waking up in a cold sweat. Anna would look at me, blushing, and say, "Lucas, are we working late tonight?" I was speechless. It had been 3 years, and she was getting better at keeping me on my toes, always finding new reasons to make me work overtime. Not a single day could be missed, normally. I didn't even dare to get up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. After a while, I collapsed exhausted onto the bed and said, "Well, tomorrow I'm going to spend the night out with my brother. Don't wait for me to come back." She sighed softly. "We're already married, and yet in your heart, you still care more about your brother than me."